So, my apologies, Moana Maki.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Unfortunately, it seems to be my lot in life to follow on from speeches of David Bennett in this House. And I have to say, I think it is the most extraordinary thing for a member of the National Party to stand up and say, we're so committed to rail, and Labour never was. Labour never was. He said we would. Who brought back the lines? Who brought back Kiwi Rail? Who put money into the rebuilding of lines like the Gisborne to Napier rail line? And who now wants to turn it into a cycleway, Mr Bennett? Your government, Mr Bennett. And I'm going to say something nice about the Honourable David Carter before he has to go to his next important meeting, and that is that this member, David Bennett, could take some lessons from David Carter in how to run a select committee. Because for all the hassles we give Mr Carter, the fact is he was a very, very good select committee chair, and I think that the member David Bennett could perhaps learn a few things from Mr Carter in that regard. But I want to talk about the what was Part 4 of the legislation now is the repeal of the Affordable Housing Enabling Territorial Authorities Act. And the first thing I want to say is that this Act, or the repeal of this Act, was hidden away in the infrastructure bill, and it shouldn't have been. Because, in fact, the repeal of affordable housing legislation has no place in an infrastructure bill. And if the government wanted to repeal it, then they should have just put it up in its own right, repealed it, allowed New Zealanders to know what was happening and to submit on it, and they didn't do that, and I think that was a shame. And again, I want to thank the clerk of the committee and all the select committee staff for all the work that they did, trying to ensure that everyone who might be interested in this repeal of legislation had the opportunity to comment. But I have no doubt there would have been many other people out there who would also have enjoyed the opportunity to comment had they known to look at an infrastructure bill that was working around bringing together the operations of utility operators for the repeal of affordable housing legislation, and I don't think it's reasonable to think that they would have thought that. Second thing I want to say is that this just backs up the fact that when it comes to affordable housing in New Zealand, this government has no plan. No plan at all. And the minister, when he gave his speech, he said that affordable housing was improving, so he didn't think it was as much of an issue. Well, on the latest statistics, housing affordability at the very best estimate is back to where it was in July 2008. And in July 2008, the Honourable Phil Heatley said that it was a disaster. It was a catastrophic event that needed to be addressed. So the fact is, the fact we've gone back to that point, which the National Party used to think was terrible, apparently now means that we don't need to do anything about affordable housing. And I think that's a dreadful contradiction in the positions of this national government. And the fact about affordable housing is we need a mix of tools, because there is no one reason why housing is unaffordable. There are many, many different reasons, so the responses are going to also be many and varied. And this power was indeed one of those tools that I believe would have been useful. And as I've said time and time again, Labour would have supported this bill going back to Select Committee to be looked at again if the government thought that it could be improved on. We would have absolutely supported that. But the fact was the 2005 New Zealand Housing Strategy acknowledged the fact that territorial authorities could have more regulatory powers, because they do everywhere else in the world. And what this Act was intending to do was it would allow territorial authorities to require developers to include affordable housing in their developments, or to contribute money, land or houses, or a mix of those, to affordable housing. In return, they could have provided incentives, they could have offset some of the costs if they'd wanted to do that. They could have reduced development contributions, they could have had rates remissions or postponements, or any other kind of financial assistance. It would have been up to the local authority to determine how they actioned that, and that the territorial authority would put together a housing affordability policy so that it was clear to developers what was expected from them in that region. And it has to be said that local authorities, some local authorities had specifically asked for this kind of regulatory making power, and that's why the legislation was drafted and passed into law. And at the same time, it needs to be acknowledged that some of the local authorities were concerned that they wouldn't have the expertise or the resources. Absolutely. Part of the process is discovering where those gaps are, because local government will always be part of the solution for housing affordability. We cannot do it without them. It's actually impossible for central government to do this without being in partnership with local government because of the fact that they control the zoning of land, they control a lot of the supply issues. We have to do it together. It's important that we find out where those gaps are. In saying that, we made sure it wasn't compulsory. This was something that local authorities could use if they wanted to, and some had said they were interested and others had said they weren't. And it would have been very interesting to see who had taken it up and who hadn't. It would have gone a long way towards addressing those gaps, as we said before, Mr. Speaker. But it was important that we started getting our local authorities thinking about housing affordability in conjunction with the work that central government is doing as well. And remember that the kind of regulatory powers that we gave local authorities are very common overseas. In fact, in some places, it would be completely it's expected that if someone, for example, wants to do a large development, a large commercial development, say a shopping mall, and this is common in some of the states in America, that, for example, they require that workers' housing be built, that the infrastructure around workers' housing be built. And in many communities and many countries around the world, that is just naturally assumed that is fair, that the developers contribute something back to the local community through these regulatory making powers that their territorial authority had. So one of the reasons we were told that it was going to be repealed was because, well, it was developed during a time of significant development activity, and now that activity is not there, so we don't need it anymore. Well, once again, that just shows you that the government has no economic plan, because apparently we don't need powers for local authorities to use during times of high development activity, because they probably don't think we're going to have times of high development activity anymore, because there is no economic plan, there is no plan for regional New Zealand, there is no plan for our big cities. Well, the fact is that Labor is not quite so pessimistic as the government, because we have a plan and we're going to be putting that plan out there at the next election, and part of that plan is that we do want to see development going on in areas that are appropriate. We do want to see affordable housing as part of that plan. We do see housing as infrastructure, and the fact that this is being repealed shows this government doesn't think housing is infrastructure. Look across the Tasman to Australia. They used to be obsessed with doing that. They don't quite like the comparison now. Australia sees housing as core infrastructure. A huge part of their stimulus package, which is still ongoing, was social and affordable housing. And this was residential housing for their citizens. That is the kind of thing that this government should be looking at. Because if you look in Auckland, we are thousands and thousands of houses short every single year. If you look in Manurewa, for example, for every 14 families who move to Manurewa, one house is being built. That is not sustainable, and this government is doing absolutely nothing about it except repealing legislation which is designed to assist local authorities and getting rid of programs like shared equity, which are an absolute integral part of the affordable housing mix in every single other country around the world just about. So what are we doing? Well, we have no plan for affordable housing under this national-led government. Their affordable housing plan was tax cuts and the RMA. Well, you know what officials told us about the RMA during the select committee process? They said that the RMA reforms aren't going to address affordable housing. Affordable housing isn't even part of the mix of the RMA reforms. And on the tax cuts that this government gave, someone on the minimum wage gets $3 a week. $3 a week that's meant to compensate for inflation, for GST increases, for rent increases, for cost of living increases, and apparently now for affordable housing. And I don't know how good this government thinks low-income people are at budgeting. They are pretty good, but they cannot stretch $3 a week that far. Now, the tax cut that the members over there gave themselves could probably go a long way towards affordable housing, but for the average Kiwi family, it absolutely will not. And I just want to finish about speaking on restrictive covenants, Mr. Speaker, because the minister in charge of this bill tried to make out that there were no changes. Well, that actually isn't true. Significant changes were made in the area of restrictive covenants. And the one I want to single out is now the restrictive covenant. If there's a covenant saying you cannot have social housing, it now has to be the primary purpose of the covenant. Whereas under the Labor government, we said any purpose. If any purpose was to restrict social housing, it was illegal. Well, this government's taken that out, and they have opened up a huge loophole. It's like their 90-day law. As long as you don't say you're discriminating, you can discriminate. Because all someone has to do is make up a primary reason why there can't be a house with, for example, disabled access, or a halfway house for prisoners, or a home for mental health clients. As long as you make up a new primary purpose for that covenant, that's okay. But It's just like the 90-day bill. As long as you don't say you're discriminating, then you can discriminate, and that is a real disappointment.